Now, when businessmen die, even well-known successful ones, there isn't usually a wave of public grief in response. But when the chairman of Apple, Steve Jobs, died this week, shrines popped up outside Apple stores across the world. President Obama said the world had lost a visionary who was bold enough to believe he could change the world. And publications were full of things like this.
He was the white wizard in the black turtleneck, holding the forces of decline at bay. We mourn his death as if he were a beloved state leader precisely because he embodied some glorious piece of what it is to be American with all our contradictions. He was an exception to nearly every rule, went off nearly every chart, overrode any sense of purpose but his own.
That was Alexis Madrigal, senior editor of The Atlantic. Well, I'm joined here in the studio by the author Ian Wilson and by Deyan Sudjic, who's director of the Design Museum. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Ian Wilson, what do you make to the reaction to Steve Jobs'
Well, you've
death?
just been mocking Charles Dickens, my favourite author, and the death of Little Nell, but I think Charles Dickens would have regarded himself as rather restrained compared with the reaction to the death of Steve Jobs, who was, as you've just said, a businessman. He was a clever businessman. He managed to speed up things that we were doing already. That's what he managed to do. He didn't change the world. Stephen Fry said he was the most important person on this planet. I mean, can you imagine any hyperbole which is more ridiculous than that?
This is ridiculous hyperbole, Deyan Sudjic.
I think when people die at 56 and they've already shown they can do quite a lot of things, there is a sense of sadness about their disappearance, the sense there were things left undone. I suppose the most poignant thing about Jobs and Apple is that though his memory will live on, probably none of the objects that he created will. I think one of the biggest things that he's done is to transform our relationship with everyday things. If you think about what telephones were like in 1976, they belonged to the government. They were tough enough to withstand being driven over by a tank, and you rented them. The telephone that we have now, it's no longer a telephone really, it's a bookshop, it's a music system, it's a GPS, as well as the phone, will last maybe 9 months and then disappear again.
But does he get the credit for that particular, the fact that the phone is so much now?
I think that the iPhone has managed to do an extraordinary amount of convergence very quickly.
But he didn't invent all these things. Admittedly, he popularised a lot of them, and admittedly some of the key things which
no, but
gadget addicts enjoy came from Jobs. But I mean,
Henry Ford did not invent the car either, but he actually managed to make it something which his workers could afford to buy rather than treat it as a land yacht.
Isn't the argument, Ian Wilson, that you say he popularised them? He certainly popularised them in a way that affected people's everyday life, so sort of constantly they were aware of...
Yes, there's a degree of truth in that. And of course, by the way, I'm not suggesting that dying at 56 and having 4 children and a grieving widow are funny. What I'm suggesting is that the hyperbole about the death is funny, and speaking about him as if he was a visionary. Well, he wasn't a visionary. He was a good designer. He was a clever boffin. He was a backroom boy. And he'll be forgotten in 2 minutes. If we're talking about phones which last 9 months and phones over which you could drive a tank, he was a phone which lasted 9 months.
Deyan Sudjic.
In 1976, the computer was as big as a house, tended by acolytes in air-conditioned comfort. What Apple and Jobs did was to actually make the computer disappear and become lots of things that we could use. I think deep down what Jobs did was understand what people want from technology rather than what technology can do to them.
Ian Wilson, when you see this response to his death, what do you think it says about our culture?
Well, I think the people who are responding in this way are the people who've become addicted to their little screens, either in handheld or their laptops. And they're rather sad people. They should get out more.
Can I ask,
because if they
do you have any
Of course,
Apple
I use all this. I don't use Apple, actually, but my wife's a keen Apple user. Of course I use all this stuff.
And is she almost emotional about it? What Apple seems to have done quite successfully...
I use a Dyson when I'm cleaning the room, and I think it's much better than a Hoover, but I don't... When Mr. Dyson dies, it will be a very sad day, but I won't think it's the same as the death of a great poet or the death of the Dalai Lama, which is what we've been having.
Do you think Apple, Deyan Sudjic, was... I mean, there was an emotional connection that Apple was capable of, which other makers of products didn't quite reach, so which is why you have people who use Apples just loving them.
Well, I think Apple and Jobs had that combination of technology and that sense of seduction through marketing. It is extraordinary how they kept changing the rules of the game. They went from making machines to, they don't make machines anymore, they say designed in California. Then they invented shops, they invented retailing. They built a cult around it. And back at Apple HQ in Cupertino, where the address says it all, one infinite loop, you do find this extraordinary compound full of brightly faced, shiny Apple types making these wonderful machines. It has become more than an object. There is something around it which you could see as being either sinister or optimistic.
Or just plain silly. I mean, that's the other thing you could see it as being.
Do you argue with your wife over this?
No, because she's not silly. She just happens to have an apple.
And at that point, gentlemen, we shall leave it. A.N. Wilson, Deyan Sudjic, thank you both very much.